This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Hey guys, time to get in on the action for the biggest moments in basketball with Prize Picks, America's #1 fantasy sports app. Just select 2 or more players, pick more or less on their projections, place your entry, and win up to 100 times your money. Right now, Prize Picks will match your first deposit of up to $100. Just download the Prize Picks app and use the code GET100. That's code GET100 on Prize Picks for a first deposit match of up to $100. Prize Picks. Pick more. Pick less. It's that easy.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Xcast. The truth is in here. I'm your host, Tony Black, joined this week by Darren Mooney. Hello, Darren.
Hello.
And I'm so excited. It's Pusher time. Pusher.
I feel like you should be playing Salt and Pepper when you announce that.
Maybe I'll just loop it in the background because, yeah, I think it deserves it. If anyone didn't know, and I'm sure there's like one of you who've been living on the moon for the last 3 years nearly of the Xcast, but Pusher is my favourite episode. So this is like the one I've been waiting for since November 2015. So no pressure, Darren, on this one to make it a memorable experience for me.
So it's practically Xmas for you, is what you're saying?
Or indeed, it's my birthday, which it is in 3 days. So as we record, yeah, I mean, it will be long gone by the time you listen to this, guys. But...
So way to ease my anxiety. It's like, I feel like I can lower the pressure here. It's like, no, it's also your birthday.
Yeah, this is technically my birthday present from you. So, you know.
Thanks for the heads up, Tony.
Yeah, I could have warned you in advance, couldn't I? But there you go.
Normally surprise parties are a surprise for the person they're being thrown for.
Yeah, not in this podcast. Today, we're talking about the Season 3 episode Pusher, which was the 17th episode of Season 3 of The X-Files. First aired on February the 23rd, 1996, and was written by Vince Gilligan and directed by Rob Bowman. And in this episode, Mulder and Scully are investigating, well, they brought onto the case of a mysterious individual called Robert Patrick Modell, who it seems can control the minds of people around him, and draws Mulder in particular into a really deadly, strange game. I'm going to ask you, but we all know what I'm going to give Pusher. So there's no real point in asking me, is there? You know, it's obviously 11. But what are you going for, Darren? Out of 10.
I've been accused in the past of being quite stingy with the scores that I award episodes, but this is a hard 10. This is like pretty much close to a perfect episode of The X-Files. I don't think it's my favourite. I would have obviously awarded that to, say, One Breath or Never Again, but I suspect Pusher is in my top 5, if not my top 3 episodes. It's certainly one of my 2 favourite episodes written by Vince Gilligan. It's probably my favourite. The other one is coincidentally also directed by Rob Bowman, so the Gilligan-Bowman combo is fantastic. But this is quintessential, like, perfect, done-in-one Monster of the Week story. And it's just beautifully constructed. It's wonderfully tense. It's also accessible. It's easy to watch. It's got a lot of fun stuff going on in the background. It's a really good episode if you're interested in Mulder and Scully, but it's also just a really good episode if you like a cool high concept executed in a wonderful manner. It's a wonderful illustration of the fact that, like, at this point, The X-Files was arguably turning out movie quality storytelling on a weekly basis on American primetime television. Pusher is an example of how you don't have to look to the mythology episodes for that. It doesn't have Mulder jumping on a train, but you could imagine this as a movie. And in fact, Gilligan originally pitched or developed this idea as a science fiction movie that he eventually sort of honed down into a 44-minute script. It's a staggering piece of television. It's one of the best pieces of television that I have ever seen. It's amazing. I'm head over heels in love with this episode. So yeah, it's a hard 10 from me.
And you know what? Given how well you've articulated that, I'm now convinced that you haven't just given it a 10 because it's my birthday and you want to make me happy, Darren. So I'm even more happy. You know,
I like how you're pushing me. I like how you're sort of Robert Patrick modelling me. It's like, Darren, you want to give this a 10.
Breeze.
Pusher is an amazing episode. Yeah.
Yeah, Pusher is the best episode of the... I should do this when I meet people, you know, just try and implant it, you know, and see if it works. But why wouldn't it be? Why wouldn't it be everyone's favourite? You know, later on in the listener feedback, we've got loads of listener feedback on Pusher, so, you know, I'll try and get through as much as I can of it.
Will you try to push through it?
I'll try. There we go.
For lots of terrible wordplay.
Yep, standard. But loads of people have said that it's their favourite episode, or it's one of their favourite episodes, you know, and, you know, it's pretty much, you know, a lot of people, it's high up for them as well. And, you know, I everything you've said, I completely agree with. You know, I really do. I think it's just perfectly put together. It's perfectly constructed. You know, it's one of those rare scripts where everything works well, you know, and I don't really think there are many scripts like that in anything, you know, movies, TV. You know, I think Back to the Future is one of those scripts. I think The Curse of Frank Black in Millennium is one of those scripts. And I think Pusher is. And it's just brilliant. And we will talk in depth about why it's brilliant. And, I struggle to just articulate properly on this. I'm just like a big fan. If there's one episode that will get me fanboying, you know, and would make me wear a T-shirt with I Love Pusher on, it's Pusher. Do you know what I mean? It's just... Oh, I just love it. And every time I watch it, I've watched this countless times. You know, I watched it again today. I don't even need to watch it anymore. You know, I can listen to it and I know all the dialogue. It's just one of them for me now.
But you want to. Like, that's the thing. Exactly. It's you don't have to, but you want to. It's like, sitting down today watching this, again, for me, it was probably the 100th time I've gone through this. And it's like, every time, it's a pleasure. I think when I got the Blu-ray editions a couple of Christmases ago, you know, the remastered HD widescreen edition of the X-Files, the first episode I stuck on may have been, it was either this or Drive. And not because, you know, obviously, as I pointed out, they're not my individual favourite episodes, but they're just episodes that kind of capture, like, the sheer, like, energy of the X-Files as a television show, and, like, the sheer, like, ability of everybody working behind the scenes. And this is obviously Gilligan on script, but Bowman as a director as well, to build basically this storytelling machine that's just incredible. It looks almost as good today. It's constructed as tightly today, like Back to the Future, which you cited, which is an example. I think they still teach it in screenwriting classes as like the closest that you will get to a perfect script, technically speaking, in terms of everything that it does. It lines up everything that it needs to do. It provides the audience with just enough exposition without burdening them with too much info. It gives them enough character without drowning them in awkward dialogue. It's perfectly made, and it's not just the script, it's the performances as well. It features, like, obviously we'll talk about some of the performances as we go, but even stuff like the use of, say, Roger Cross and Steve Batchik, who are like the X-Files repertoire company at this point, but they're really well used in this episode as sort of law enforcement characters, and they sort of do that again. I think Gilligan uses them again in, say, Folie à Deux in the 5th season. But like the pacing, the framing, the composition, the action sequences, like, it's just so well done.
All across the board, completely. This has got me wondering, actually, and I suppose this is a little bit of an aside, but it sort of leaps off what we're talking about. Now, obviously Pusher is high up in terms of TV episodes for both of us. I mentioned The Curse of Frank Black before in Millennium. Now that for me is my favourite piece of TV ever. Like, I love that. You know, when we do the Time Is Now podcast, I can't wait to talk about The Curse of Frank Black, because I watch it every year on Halloween religiously, and I think it's just perfect. But have you ever thought, and have you come up with your what you think is the perfect, or your favourite perfect piece of television, an episode?
It would really depend on my mood, but you're actually It's interesting that you should mention The Curse of Frank Black, because I'd almost go to like Owls and Roosters from the second season of Millennium, because I think that's just a perfectly constructed two-parter. It's this wonderful sort of television movie almost, that feels perfectly designed for Darren's pet interests. It's got like occultism, Hitler, conspiracy theories, family breakdown. It's got all of these things jammed in together, secret Nazis, and obviously the Illuminati, and this like occult ritual and stuff. It's all crammed in there, and it's fantastic. Oh, and it's also got a horse with no name playing as well, so that helps there.
Oh,
but I mean, there's even stuff like episodes of Star Trek, like The Measure of a Man from the Next Generation would be one of the episodes I would consider fantastic. A couple of episodes of Deep Space Nine, like say In the Pale Moonlight, which is I think the finest script that Ronald D. Moore has ever written, and that's saying something, given that Ronald D. Moore has written some amazing episodes of television. He's not even credited on it, I believe, which is astounding. But yeah, so yeah, this would be sort of like, this would for me, X-Files wise, be behind Never Again and One Breath, but this would be in the conversation. Like, this would be like if somebody asked me to point to not just an X-Files, but an episode of television that you could watch and enjoy, like, Pusher would be very close to it.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably my favourite X-File. But yeah, I mean, One Breath is up there for me as well. And another one that my most recent, for me, perfect episode of television ever is the second season finale of Hannibal.
Yes,
which is just incredible. Like, I've watched that so many times. It is just amazing television,
and it's built very much in the same way as Pusher as well. It's that sort of ticking, mounting tension, which works ridiculously well, and it works surprisingly well in television. Because I mean, this is one of the things where and again, we're getting sidetracked here, but like Christopher Nolan, say, when he was making Dunkirk last year, or when he was making the year before, Dunkirk is notable as being his shortest film, I think, since Following, his very first film. And it's only 100 minutes long, which is actually quite short by the standards of modern blockbusters, and particularly by the length of his films, where they're normally like, they reach 2 hours and 40 minutes. And the reason he found that was that it was impossible for him to sustain momentum for more than 100 minutes. He found that it became dizzy and it became almost sort of like concussive if you maintained it for longer than 100 minutes. And I kind of feel like maybe there's something in that with television, in that television's ability to do propulsive suspense stories. Like, I mean, you mentioned the second season finale of Hannibal. Like, one of the things I really love about that episode of television is how early in the episode a metronome starts playing in the back of the episode. A tick, tick, tick. And it maintains, it's there in the soundtrack throughout as the events build towards the climax that the show has been teasing since the very first episode of the season, which is this horrific sort of Red Wedding style reckoning with all of the primary cast. But it builds to it perfectly. And Pusher does something very, very similar, where it starts out by showing you what he can do, and then it builds towards this big climactic, like this wonderfully intimate, because it's literally just 3 people in a room, but also this seemingly like epic and mythologized finale between Modell and Mulder. Now, we'll talk about it in a bit more depth later on, but it feels like everything is perfectly engineered to get to that point with very little let up. I mean, we're not going to talk about specific scenes yet, but one of the things about Pusher is, as I mentioned, I watch this countless times. I watch it a lot. Frequently, I will watch it, and people will be in the room who are not necessarily X-Files fans. I've had to actually stop the episode, pause the episode, because somebody who was nominally not watching television in the same room as me was like, "Oh, I'm going to do this thing. You watch your stories. I'm going to do this thing." But they got really uncomfortable with the sequence with Frank Burst on the phone, with Modell pushing him, and it's a scene that's driven primarily by dialogue. It's got really great framing. It's really tight, claustrophobic, and intense. But like the other person in the room, and this has happened several times, is never watching the episode, but it's just on in the background, and it sort of takes their focus to an extent that it's actually uncomfortable and like claustrophobic for them to watch it. It's an astounding effect, and I've seen it several times. It's a testament to like how well constructed Pusher is, that even if you're not watching it actively, like that sequence can still give you a panic attack.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me at all. Yeah, I'm going to try and test this now. I'm going to try and put it on when someone's when my wife to be is in the room and see if it hooks her in, actually, because she's only watched the first season and a little bit of the X-Files, so it's my mission to get her through it one day.
That's your next podcast. Once you get to the end of this run of podcasts, it'll be yourself and the wife. It'll be like a family affair.
I tell you what, if I could convince her, that would be a great sequel to the X-Cast, the double X-Cast.
Double X-Cast, yes, I like that.
But no, you're spot on, and I think it's interesting how Vince Gilligan actually said to Chris Carter after he turned in a draft that he was so proud that he thought this would be the best work he ever did for the X-Files, and Carter turned around and said to him that you shouldn't think that way because the goal is always to better yourself, which is a fair enough comment, I think, as a showrunner, definitely. But, I mean, Vince Gilligan has written some amazing things in his career, and, I'm one of the 5 people in the world who hasn't watched Breaking Bad yet, so I can't comment on that yet. But in terms of the X-Files, I think this might be the best thing he ever did. So it's interesting how, he thought that even when he'd written it. Before we move on, the IMDb general rating, which we always do, is 8.7 out of 10 for Pusher, and that puts it in the higher tier for this season. You're going to love this, Darren. It doesn't even beat The Blessing Way.
Yeah, I've learned that I should maybe keep my opinions on the rating of The Blessing Way to myself. It's been suggested. So I'm going to steer away from that little bait that you're laying out there, Tony.
I am blatantly laying out some bait.
Gently kick it back towards you. I will say, though, I do think that's a very low rating, actually. A surprisingly low rating, which is rare. Like, there's a very rare episode of television where you could say, 87%, which is an A grade by any measure, is an underwhelming result for this film, or this piece of entertainment. But I feel like 8.7 is a little low. Because we did Paperclip, and Paperclip's around 9, isn't it?
Yeah, well, Paperclip's 9.2, Clive Bruckman's 9.3, but Pusher is also beaten by The Blessing Way. It's beaten by 731, which is a great episode, don't get me wrong, but, it's beaten by War of the Copra, whatever you say it. It's beaten by Apocrypha, and it's beaten by... it's equalled by Talitha Kumi, beaten by Ose Chung. So, it's not in the... it should be in the 9s, but for whatever reason, it's not, which is a bit of a surprise. I mean, IMDb is not a 100% reliable aggregator, of course. This is out of 2,781 votes, So it's...
You don't have to justify it, Tony. You don't have to justify it. Don't make excuses for it.
I know. But, we know it's wonderful. So let's dig in. Let's dig deep, and let's get to the heart of Pusher. So yeah, the episode begins with a really great teaser, which I think introduces the character of Robert Patrick Modell, who is known nominally as Pusher because he pushes his will onto others, as we later find out when we meet Detective Frank Burst in the next. When he speaks to Mulder and Scully in the following scene after the credits. But this teaser sort of, it's very good in establishing the kind of character that Modell is, really. In that he's in this shopping mall, he's collecting all his tins of, his incredible amount of tins of Carbo Boost, which we later find out he needs for energy. And he's, humming along and to all the supermarket tinny music going on, but you just get this impression of a very cocky guy who knows exactly why he's there, and it's very rare you get such a sense of character straight away, I think, considering that this whole episode is framed around a villain, and a villain in almost a comic book sense, I think.
It's actually interesting that you should mention sort of a comic book villain, because he very much, he is a comic book villain. This is one of the interesting things about Gilligan's writing in general. So, for example, Softlight, which was the first script that he wrote for the show, and he wrote it before he became a regular staff writer, and I know that you're very fond of it. I'm a bit less fond of it, I think, than you are. But one of the things about Softlight is basically an X-File where he takes the origin of Dr. Manhattan from Alan Moore and David Gibbons' Watchmen and basically builds an X-Files episode around it. It's like a scientist who gets locked in his machine and then is basically transformed into something much more powerful and then goes on some sort of in this case, goes on a killing spree. And Pusher is very much very similar to that, in that it's very much, it's a guy, there's a point early on where he's in the car with Burst in the teaser and he's like, it'd really help us if you gave us your name. And Modell's response is Pusher is good enough. And even later on when Scully's talking about, the stories that he told when he was applying to join the FBI, where he trained with Gurkhas in Nepal and ninjas in Japan, that's Batman's origin story that he's given himself. But, he's calling himself Pusher in the same way, and, Gilligan does it later on as well with, and I know you haven't seen Breaking Bad, but there's a very strong through line in Gilligan's work building to, say, Breaking Bad, where Walter White, who is this sort of very mediocre man, and we'll probably talk about masculinity and this idea of how Gilligan approaches little men who wishes they were big later on, but he also approaches Heisenberg, he also approaches Walter White as a comic book villain. I think Warren Ellis, who is one of the great British comic book writers, has written that Breaking Bad is one of the great supervillain origin stories in modern pop culture. And there's a recurring thing throughout that where Walter White reinvents himself as Heisenberg. He gives himself a supervillain code name and a supervillain trademark. And he basically, there are points throughout the narrative where he insists that other people don't call him don't call him White. They call him Heisenberg. Say my name, and the name that he wants them to say is Heisenberg. And there's a real sense of that with Pusher as well, where Pusher feels very much like a comic book villain. And even, say, the way that he dresses throughout the episode, where he dresses in, and you have that cerulean blue bit at the end of the teaser, but you'll notice that throughout the episode, Modell is dressed consistently in shades of blue, whether it's sort of the blue jumpery thing that he wears early on, or the blue suit, the flamboyant blue suit that he wears in court later on. He's very colourful, and he's very out there, and he's very much styling himself in the mode of a comic book character. And it's interesting to note one of Gilligan's few screenplay credits is actually for Hancock. Which is a superhero movie that largely deconstructs superheroes. Now, obviously, he left that to work on Breaking Bad, and apparently Peter Berg was angry with him until he actually saw Breaking Bad. He's like, okay, I can kind of see it now. But one of the things, apparently, the final script toned down a lot of the superhero stuff that Gilligan was playing with when he worked on the script of Hancock. So I totally 110% buy the idea that Robert Patrick Modell is meant to be a supervillain, a comic book supervillain.
Yeah, and he is part of that sort of training ground for Walter White, isn't he? I mean, I have seen the first season of Breaking Bad, actually. I say this. So, but I know that that's sort of like an hors d'oeuvre really for what's to come from what people have told me. So I know the general setup of Breaking Bad, and I don't know any spoilers really for it, but I know roughly, sort of what it's about essentially. So yeah, I think there is a lot of Gilligan playing with a lot of these ideas that he then blossom into this sort of modern day take on the comic book supervillain, and it's very clear in here. I mean. The other thing I've always thought about Pusher, and I'm sure I'm not the first person to think this, is that it's very much Sherlock Holmes and Moriarty. And I think, Pusher is the kind of Moriarty character. He is the foil for Mulder. He is that challenge. He is that trickster who wants to play a game and wants to test, he's the worthy adversary. He even says that at one point, doesn't he? He says, I'm looking for a worthy adversary. Which is exactly...
it's not Burst.
Exactly. I gotta tell you, you got the greatest name. But it's I mean, Burst is Lestrade, really. If we really want to go into the Conan Doyle thing, Burst is Inspector Lestrade. He's the sort of hapless detective who has to get, the genius Holmes, Mulder, on the case. And Scully's Watson. It's very much there in this episode, whether it's intentional or not by Gilligan. It's writ large in a way. It's this whole idea of the nemesis character for Mulder, and giving him in this teaser that flavour of this guy. I think it just immediately sets it off in being something that the show has never quite done before. And that's the other thing with Pusher. When you watch the series before this, I don't think there's been an episode really equivalent to Pusher. Even things like Fire with Cecil Lively, I'm just dying for a cigarette, all that kind of thing. They didn't quite work in the same way, did they, as Pusher, in terms of, establishing that real foil for Mulder's character.
You're quite right when you say this is sort of ground zero for a lot of Gilligan's later stuff, and it's telling that a lot of Gilligan's later scripts, in particular, tend to work quite well at giving foils for Mulder. So, for example, he worked on Dreamland, the two-parter with John Shaban and Frank Spotnitz, but I would be not at all surprised to discover that Morris Fletcher was largely derived by Gilligan, because he's the same archetype as most Modell and as Walter White. He's the same sort of pathetic, like, failure of a human being who has something wonderful and miraculous or life-changing happen to him, and then uses it as an excuse to indulge his worst impulses. And like, one of the things that Gilligan plays with, and we'll probably talk a little bit about later on, but like, Gilligan is very interested in this idea of narrativizing and stories and how people build up narratives around themselves. And that's obviously part of why his characters, like obviously Modell picks Pusher and Walter White picks Heisenberg, but why Gilligan's characters tend to construct like romantic myths about themselves, you know, that justify what they're doing. And Modell, I think you're right when you say that Modell sees himself, like he actually says, I'm looking for a worthy adversary, and it's clearly not that, you know, fat lump lying dead at your feet. But what Modell wants is he wants to construct a story. Like, Modell's superpower, and this is interesting again because, like, Gilligan has talked about Walter White, and I know you haven't talked about Breaking Bad, so we won't talk about it too much, but Gilligan has argued that, like, Walter White's superpower, and that's the word that Gilligan uses in interviews, he says superpower, is lying, whether it's lying to himself or it's lying to other people. And that's very much in key with what Modell does. Modell's superpower is his ability to use words, and his ability to talk, and his ability to talk and to, through talking, manipulate both the minds of others and also the world around him. So he's actually seeking control. He's seeking to build a romantic narrative about himself, to give himself a purpose, to instill his life with a sense of meaning, which is interesting because, again, I think we touched on this before when we talked about, like, the X-Files. Like, obviously the X-Files is about a lot of different things. It encapsulates a lot of the big themes of, like, the 90s. It's about, you know, trust, paranoia, faith, belief, hope, all these sort of big existential ideas. But it's also one of the things that I think this is one of the reasons why it resonates with a lot of people. It's one of the reasons why it resonates with me. The X-Files is in large part also about meaning. It's about trying to find meaning in life and in existence. It's, you know, sometimes it's in a literal sense about trying to find the reason why spooky things or inexplicable things happen, or to find answers to questions, or to find like an absolute truth. But sometimes it's a search for meaning in a more abstract sense, in a like a why are we here sense, in a like a what is the purpose of this sense, in like a what does my life amount to? Is everything that I believed a lie? Is everything that I wanted to believe the truth? Does that matter? Does my life have any meaning? And Modell is grappling with that question in a very basic and very sort of simple and very direct way, in that he's a failure of a human being. Scully accounts for, it's like he applied for the Navy SEALs and he ended up working as a supply chief, to give an example. He applied to the FBI and he was caught in like several self-aggrandizing lies. Like, by any measure, Robert Patrick Modell is a perfectly adequate, nondescript human being. He's very intelligent, but that hasn't helped him find a meaning or purpose in his life. He's resourceful, but he's living in a dingy apartment, and like there's a point where Burst makes a really cheap dig at Modell and how empty his apartment is, how empty his life implicitly is. And the fact that, like, when he discovers he has brain cancer, he doesn't actually want to continue living. He's happy to use that and to use the gift that the brain cancer gives him to give himself a sense of purpose, to construct a story around himself. And there's something like very primal in that, and there's something very like in keeping with like it. For example, like you had obviously Jose Chung's From Outer Space, which ends with that really beautiful like one-liner from Jose Chung about how we may not be alone in the universe, but we're all alone down here. And Modell seems to be grappling with that question in a way that's it's much pulpier, it's much less direct than having Jose Chung actually come out and state it, but it feels very much of a piece with that, if that makes sense. Like, Modell is trying to make sense of his life, and he's been given this ability to tell a story, to literally to use his words to change the world around him. And the story that he's chosen to tell is the one that you're quite right to point out. It's the story of Holmes and Moriarty. It's the story of the devilish and fiendish villain who must be outwitted and defeated by a worthy opponent, because Modell knows he's going to die. Modell understands that he's brain cancer and it's not curable, and no matter what happens he's going to die, so he might as well die a heroic death. And in fact, one of the really dark, twisted things about the episode, and kind of like one of those moments where you're like, Vince Gilligan has a really, really dark sense of humor, is the fact that the episode even denies Modell the closure of an ending by putting him in a coma. And I think there's something telling, like, we won't talk about Kitsunagiri, the sequel episode, too much, but in that, again, like, Gilligan compounds that sense of, like, karmic retribution for how evil and petty Modell is by refusing him control of his own narrative, which is like this wonderful sort of like the universe is basically coming back and kicking Modell in the ass for his arrogance and his assumption. So he wants this heroic death at the hand of Mulder, and it's very like one of the smarter, shrewder, subtler things the script does is to deny him that by putting him in a coma and having like Scully basically say, look, we're done, he isn't worth the time.
Yeah, it's how he loses, really, isn't it? And that's the thing. It's interesting because there's also another little sting in the tail, which at the end, obviously, it's one of those mythic stories he can create that he's, a dying, a villain essentially, But what Scully says to Mulder at the end is that he could have cured himself. He could have had the operation to remove the tumor, in time, but he chose not to. He chose to do this and to pursue this gift that he found he had once he started to have brain cancer, and do what he did, and that's another little dark little stinger in that Modell could have lived. He could have. I mean, we know obviously he does return in another episode, but he didn't have to go down this path. He chose to do this, like for the reasons you've just said, and that I think gives it even more. It takes away that almost that tragedy that he was going to die. He had nothing. In this case, he chose to go down this route in order to. I think it's Scully who says, he was a little man who just, or Mulder says he was a little man who just wanted to be big, and that was the whole choice he made, and I find that really interesting as well.
Well, that's the archetypal Gilligan antagonist, is the little man who dreams that he's big, and you see it reflected in various characters written over the course of like his time on both this show and The Lone Gunman, and obviously in Breaking Bad. Like, I mean, for example, Roach is in Paper Hearts is another example of a little man who dreams that he was big, in that he constructs this like romantic fantasy to justify murdering little girls. To pick an example, Morris Fletcher has this absolutely amazing, impossible body swap thing happen to him, and what does he use it to do? He uses it to cheat on his wife. It's like that you have this sort of like wonderful, like Gilligan's a very, like, he comes across, he's a very charming man, particularly when you watch him in interviews. He's very cool. I engage with him a little bit, and he is actually, he comes across a very nice man, but his writing has this wonderful sarcastic edge to it, and you get a sense that Gilligan is very cynical about people. There's a really wonderful quote from one of the interviews around Breaking Bad, just when it was about to become popular, where he explains that his philosophy amounts to, like, he was asked about his religious beliefs, and his philosophy was like, well, I'm not sure if there's a heaven, but I absolutely have to believe that there's a hell. And you kind of get a little bit of that from how he writes his characters, because Modell is somebody who would rather be somebody bad, twisted, and evil than be nobody at all. And there's something very heartbreaking, very sad in that.
There's quite a fatalism about a lot of his writing, actually. When you think about a lot of the episodes that he wrote in the X-Files, a lot of the characters that he ended up writing for. I suppose it's a bit of an X-Files trope in that, bad things happen to people, all the time, a lot of the guest characters. But you think about something like Chester Banton in Soft Light, who ends up this, haunted pawn of the government. You think of someone like Pusher, who is, he's this twisted guy who's denied, as you said, his own story. You think of someone like Crump in Drive, who ends up dead by the end, and it's, even though he's trying to, he's been a victim of these government tests and things like this. And you look at all these different kind of characters. They're not all the same kind of character, but they all have, there's a real fatalism about a lot of what he does, in that he doesn't really believe people are going to get any sense of justice or closure in a way. And especially with his, his guest characters and these vivid characters he creates around Mulder and Scully. And Pusher is probably his best example of that, leading up to when he really, found his own voice and his own name in Breaking Bad. Did you also spot that there's a little bit of a nod to the Fluke Man in this teaser as well?
Yes, at the stand, at the sort of stand at the cashiers. And actually, I love that, because Fluke Man tends to. There are a number of other references throughout the show to Fluke Man as well. I like the idea of Fluke Man, because Fluke Man is a great monster. He's basically the X-Files doing like a Universal monster movie villain. So it's kind of nice that they all remember him, and it's kind of cool that that he kind of comes up again and again and again. That there's that he's gone, but he's not forgotten, Tony.
Well, exactly, and I think, we do get a sequel to Fluke Man in Hosts, which is in the Joe Harris season 10 comics, but on screen we never got a Fluke Man sequel, and he always seemed like one of those monsters who, you know, really deserve, like Toombs. He was one of the iconic X-Files monsters who never quite got a sequel. So it's interesting to see him get a nod in this.
Well, I mean, what was the guy who played him doing? I mean, I can't. Like, surely they would have been able to dig him out.
It's strange, isn't it? Yeah, just, you know, put him in a costume, and this is it. It's almost like the show. You know, I mean, Pusher just picks up the National Enquirer with, you know, reports of more Fluke Man attacks and sort of just laughs, you know, at the idea. And it's almost that the show he's going, well, you know, look at what we did before. Look at this. This is a different kind of villainy. That's almost what I thought it was sort of suggesting, that, you know, Modell is a very different kind of monster, you know, and the show has got comfortable now in, yes, it can tell, you know, the parasites in, like, meteorites under the ice, you know, it can do all the, you know, volcano parasites, and then it can do, you know, demons and ghosts and all this kind of thing, but it can also do different kind of monsters of the week, and Modell is a great example of a villainous comic book monster of the week, very different from Fluke Man. So I don't know where you got that, but I sort of picked that up, and it might be a little bit of a sort of nod and a wink to that, really.
Well, he is. He's very much an embodiment of the evil that men do, as opposed to, like... And this is one of the things with the X-Files, is you have these various conceptions of evil that play out, and all the different... And, like, again, we talked about this on the show before. One of the things that I love about the X-Files is that it's not one voice. It's not Chris Carter marshalling the writing staff in the same way that I know David Chase would do on The Sopranos, where it's like you have a meeting and this is what we're doing this year, and this is what you're doing, this is what you're doing, but it's all playing towards this. You instead have like an opportunity for different voices to come out, and so you end up getting like meditations on particular themes. So you get stuff like Gilligan dealing with stuff that Darren Morgan does, but doing it in a slightly different way. And like, so for example, evil, the concept of evil, right? And to Carter, the concept of evil is something that exists external. It's mysterious. It influences us. It seduces us. It wears down our defenses, and it sneaks past us, and it creeps inside us, and it affects us. You know, the black oil is one of the great examples of that. Whereas for like Morgan and Wong, evil is something innate. It's within us. We have to fight it ourselves. Everybody has a raging battle of evil happening sort of in them at any given moment. And if we let our guards down, we're susceptible to that sort of happening from within us rather than without us. And then, ironically enough, you have Gilligan coming along. Gilligan's idea of evil is basically the idea of, you know, it's basically apathy. For Gilligan, evil is like being mundane. Evil is like being pathetic. Evil is like just being willing to be somebody bad rather than being nobody at all. It's the pursuit of like self-actualization at the expense of everybody else, because that's Gilligan's recurring theme. Is like, how you define evil is somebody who basically, and like Scully points it out when it comes to Modell's attitude towards other people, where he sees them as props for his own self-aggrandizement. That's how Gilligan's villains see the world, and Gilligan's basic conception of evil amounts to being selfish. It amounts to somebody who's unwilling to acknowledge the personhood or the integrity or the autonomy of other people around them, and instead seeks their own self-actualization no matter what the cost. So Walter White has to be the best at what he does. It doesn't matter whether that's, you know, making drugs or being, you know, he's... Same thing with Modell here. Modell wants to be a somebody. He's a little man who dreams of being big, even if that big man, you know, is a monster. And it's basically like it's a human monster at the heart of the story. And
I suppose it's a different kind of psychopath, really. You know, if you boil down the essence of what a psychopath is, somebody without any sort of, you know, acknowledgement of other human feeling and cannot emote in any kind of way. You know, they are those kind of characters, you know, but perhaps more of an extreme sort of sociopath, you know, that kind of very different monster, you know, as we talked about. So it works in establishing that really well. And, you know, as you get through the episode, what I like about Pusher is that it adds in these interesting quirks. I mean, one of the first ones is when Burst presents the case to them, and then he's written what looks like Ninor on as like a little clue, Pusher. Then Mulder figures out the Ronin connection, which obviously goes back to this kind of Japanese mythology. You know, a samurai without a master is what a Ronin is, and then there's the link to American Ronin, a magazine. So it starts the game that Pusher's playing is very much, you know, connected, and it's breadcrumbs from Mulder to follow. But I love the way it sort of establishes all of these little quirks. You know, later, you know, you mentioned it earlier about the Gurkhas in, you know,
Nepal
Tibet and Nepal, yeah, you know, and all this
ninjas in Japan,
in Japan, and this backstory that he creates and this legend that he creates for himself, which is all rubbish. You know, it's none of it's true. You know, it's all this. You know,
mythology.
This mythology, this internal mythology, and the way that the episode sort of layers that in as breadcrumbs for Mulder, I think he's brilliant.
It's more than that, though, because, I mean, the thing about the Ronin is something that, and it goes back to that sort of comic book pulpy quality we're talking about there, where, like, if you look at, like, you trace the legacy of, like, pulp narrative and pulp history, like, it goes through, like, the samurai characters, like, the samurai myth, the Edo period in Japan, like, obviously through to the films of, say, Akira Kurosawa in the 50s, which were then repurposed as, like, the American westerns, you know, The Magnificent Seven, A Fistful of Dollars being remakes of Kurosawa films, for example, and, like, you could argue then that the comic book characters, you know, were the replacement of, like, cowboys. Like, you have, like, Spielberg and sort of Scorsese at the moment arguing that comic book movies are replacements for, like, westerns and American pop consciousness. So it's almost like in marketing himself as a Ronin, like, it's almost as if Modell is tracing, like, a conceptual narrative history of who or what he is. He's, like, saying, he's pointing out to Mulder, look, this is my basis in, like, you know, pulp fiction, not necessarily in actual history, because, like, Mulder doesn't know what a Ronin is from history. He knows what it is because he watched Yojimbo, which is a fantastic film. I wholeheartedly recommend it, and obviously a basis for A Fistful of Dollars. But it's very much, it feels like Modell is, and you're right when you talk about, like, Moriarty and sort of Sherlock Holmes and stuff. Like, there's a moment later on where he harasses Mulder through the payphone, and that's lifted directly from Dirty Harry. You know, the bit where he taunts the police detective over the payphone. It recalls a sequence where Scorpio is doing that to Dirty Harry, where he's like, oh, you gotta get it here in this amount of minutes, and I know if you'll be followed. And it's sort of like, it's very much like Modell's not just, like, not just positioning himself as somebody important. He's building a narrative. He's building a story. He's, like, constructing this thriller narrative that we're watching, which is kind of interesting.
Speaking of Yojimbo, am I right in thinking that your podcast, it's a terrible shield time, but your podcast, The 250, has done an episode on Yojimbo?
It has. We did it a few weeks ago with Chris Lavery, one of our guests. I love it. It's a fantastic episode. And hold on, I'm going to do my pusher voice here. You should definitely listen to it. You want to listen to it. You can listen to it right now. But yeah. Stop
putting the whammy on me, Darren. Stop putting the whammy on me.
What is the scientific nature of the whammy? So many great lines.
There's so many great lines, and you know that this kind of, I suppose, is a good entry point into talking about Mulder in this sense, because, you know, obviously once Mulder's starting to lead these breadcrumbs, and you know, he has that phone conversation with Pusher, you know, at the payphone, and then, you know, Pusher leads him to the golf range, and you've got that horrible sequence where, you know, Collins, the SWAT guy, immolates himself, sets himself on fire. And which really shows you just how far Pusher's really willing to go now, even though he's already killed a cop, as we know. You really get this sense that Mulder, you know, in a lot of cases, Mulder is obviously the kind of louche, sort of dispassionate, you know, investigator, coming up with all these, you know, theories and things like this. And though he gets passionate about the supernatural aspect, quite often Mulder isn't necessarily passionate or involved or just, you know, troubled by the characters involved and by what's happening. You know, there's a lot of episodes where Mulder is, you know, excited because there might be a ghost involved, or there might be you know, he might be able to find a new discovery or something. But you never really get that sense always that he's truly affected by what's going on. But Pusher's different. Pusher is one of those episodes that really gets under his skin as a character. And there's a great comment I'll come to later by my friend Matt Latham, which talks a little bit about how this sort of brings Mulder down off a certain pedestal, you know, really, in some respects, in that he sometimes can have a level of arrogance about him, which is often charming, and it's not a detriment to his character. But this kind of strips that back a bit, in that he knows that this guy isn't just dangerous, and isn't just possessed of some kind of, you know, supernatural paranormal power that, you know, he's very much in the X-Files wheelhouse, but he's also a psychopath, and he is also someone who will kill to preserve this game that he wants Mulder to play. And that's really quite terrifying, I think, for Mulder as a character.
It is. And I mean, one of the interesting things about Pusher, and I mean, we talked earlier about how, like, he's the archetypal Gilligan character, because one of Gilligan's recurring motifs, and it's kind of interesting that we go back and we watch them now, because it's always been there, but it seems particularly relevant now, and particularly in the wake of Breaking Bad, is that Gilligan is very interested in what we would today describe as toxic masculinity. But this idea idea of machismo and this idea of what it is to be a man and how a man presents himself and how a man acts and how a man expresses himself through violence or through sex or through all these different things, these ways that men present themselves. And you sort of see it here, obviously, with Modell. You see it with, like, Breaking Bad is perhaps the most obvious example where, you know, Gilligan constructs this sort of grotesque American fable about this self-made man who just wants to do his business and, you know, he wants this sort of traditional family home and he wants to assert his masculinity and his pride won't be harmed in any way, shape or form. But even here in this episode, you have this idea, like, for example, like, it's telling that in Modell's protein drinks, like, they're introduced with shots of big macho men on them. You know, you have, for example, you have this sort of, like, big muscle-bound guy going on. But the thing is that you have this thing happening later on where he meets Holly, for example, and Holly, who is Skinner's secretary. And again, this is one of those, like, set-up and payoff things. It's like Gilligan's very clockwork script. Early on, you meet Holly and she's been attacked, and she explains that it was a mugger, and they didn't catch him, and then later on, you have Modell using that to get her to attack Skinner, right? But the sequence with Holly, you have this bit where Modell basically plays into this masculine revenge fantasy with this woman who he doesn't know from Adam, this woman he didn't know before, this woman whose name he probably doesn't even know at this point in the script, where he basically brushes her hair aside gingerly, and he says to her, "I wish I could get my hands on the guy that did that to you. I'd make him pay." And there's this idea, like, that's what a man does. A man acts violently and aggressively and sort of protects those near to him. And one of the interesting aspects of Pusher, one of the really sort of, like, subversive and sort of twisty and sort of, like, really sort of clever needling aspects of Pusher, is the implication that Mulder is in some way getting off on this, that not in like a sick or perverse way, but that some aspect of Mulder is responding to the narrative that Modell is constructing on the primal level. Like, it's telling, for example, in the sequence where, you know, Scully the first time that Scully describes Modell as a little man who wishes he was big, it's telling that they're on a firing range at the FBI. And Mulder's last line in that scene is to say, "He's laughing at us, Scully." As if to say, look, my masculinity has been threatened in this. My masculinity's been undermined by the existence of Modell. And, like, at the end, it's Mulder who wanders off into the hospital in order to confront Modell, which is a fantastically reckless thing for Mulder to do, knowing what Modell is capable of. You could just wait and pick him up outside. You could move in with you can't move in with a tactical team because of what he can do with his voice, but just wait and pick him up outside, tranquilize him and drag him into the back of a car. Don't go into a hospital where there are patients, where you know, even if you don't have a gun, you're still presenting yourself to him for a mano-a-mano confrontation. It's telling that, like, at the end, what breaks Modell's spell, isn't Mulder's strength of will or strength of character or his masculinity asserting itself. It's Scully daring to think outside, like, the boundaries of the game or the rules that sort of Modell has constructed by sounding the alarm and shattering his hold on Mulder. So it's like, there's an interesting thing where, like, Mulder seems to, at least on some level, be playing into those masculine fantasies of Modell, that he's playing into this idea of, like, a cop and robber story. Because, you know, as much as Modell wants to see himself as, you know, Moriarty, watching the episode, part of me suspects that, like, not consciously, not aggressively, not assertively, but some part of Mulder probably wants to see himself as Sherlock Holmes in this story. And I think you get that. And I think that Duchovny sort of plays into that, particularly with, like, his banter with Modell, where it's very much, it's almost like an 80s action movie banter. It's like, how'd you do it? It's like, made you look. There's something very interesting there. It's very sort of, it's fascinating. It's kind of, it suggests a bit more going underneath the kind of really smooth, really polished exterior, that there's something kind of a little bit unsettling there.
Well, I think as well, by this point, the commentators and critics and, you know, people who were analysing the X-Files had sort of clued into this idea that Mulder was a bit like a modern Sherlock Holmes. You know, that he had these deductive leaps of logic, that he was this genius who, you know, Holmes was, you know, considered a genius in the stories, but he was an eccentric. You know, he wasn't like somebody who, you know, the police consulted with him and things like that, but he was on the outside. You know, he never wanted to be part of the, you know, the inner circle and things like this. He, you know, he had all these quirks and these eccentricities, and Mulder's exactly the same. You know, he likes his porn. You know, there's even a line in this where Duchovny suggested that it was when Mulder's being fitted for a camera, the script originally had him say something like, does it get the Discovery Channel? And Duchovny said, well, Mulder loves porn, let's change it to the Playboy Channel. And it works much better in that context. There's the sunflower seeds. There's all these little different things that Mulder's got that give him quirks, that give him eccentricities. And obviously we know he's on the outside of the inner circle at the FBI because of what he does. So there is very much from early on this idea that he is this sort of modern Holmes figure, and Scully is his Watson, this grounded central character who is from the real world, who has connections from the real world, who can bring him back to Earth, and be that, important, dynamic in the relationship that keeps him grounded, that keeps him sane. And so it's very much there in the very DNA of the X-Files. So it feels like this episode is really trying to tap into that in a way that the only other episode I think that flirted with this, but it didn't do it in the same way, was Young at Heart in season 1 with John Barnett. who
I think this is the
being...
only time that anybody's ever mentioned Young at Heart and Pusher in the same sort of sentence.
Well, only...
comparatively, they are identical, Tony.
Only in the sense, right? Because obviously, that episode ended up being quite silly with, Mulder trying to face a dead man with a salamander hand, or whatever it was. But...
That's when it got silly. Not in, like, the creepy guy at court making eye contact with Mulder.
Yeah. I'll get you. But that whole...
That's really helping your case there, Bob.
But I think in the sense that episode was trying to establish that Mulder, when he was in Violent Crimes, in the late 80s, he had this nemesis, this guy, the one who got away, this John Barnett figure who was, this murderer criminal who enjoyed teasing Mulder. You see in those flashbacks when he's in court, and like we said, he's winking at him, and he's almost got a Jack Nicholson grin about him. He's almost a bit like the Joker more than the Pusher is Moriarty. So they're not. This is much more sophisticated and much better written and much better constructed, and it's not the same story at all. But in the sense that I think the writers have been looking, or Chris Carter or whoever, I think even, like you said, subconsciously, have been looking to give Mulder, if he is this genius sort of detective who has these, deductive leaps that sort of put him on a different level, I think they liked the idea of having him challenged by somebody who was going to make him leap to that game. And I think your analysis there's something to it, definitely. I think there is an element of Mulder, even though he hates Modell and he's repulsed by a lot of what he does, especially when he kills Frank Burst. Like, you killed this man for nothing, you sick bastard. There is also that level with Mulder that he's fascinated by this man and fascinated by the psychology of it. So I think you're right, and I think it does tap into these ideas that have been at the heart of the X-Files since day one.
And I mean, there's also a bit more there as well, because I mean, one of the things about the third season of the X-Files as a whole, and why I would argue that it's one of the best 20-odd episode seasons of television ever made, and the best season of the X-Files overall, despite my love of the 8th season, is because, despite the fact that there are a lot of standalone episodes in it, and the standalone quality is fantastic, there's also this weird sort of tonal resonance that goes through it, where even in, like, standalone episodes, you're dealing with, like, themes and ideas that tie back to the mythology and to recurring sort of fixations. So, for example, in Oubliette, for example, you obviously had Mulder dealing with this idea of, the woman who is not his sister, but who is in a similar situation to his sister, who is also in a similar situation to another woman who's being victimized not by the government but by a serial killer. And even in Pusher, for example, you have this recurring theme that ties into this idea of, like, masculinity and toxic masculinity, of, like, Modell asserting control over other people, and it's telling that the only character who ever really gets to talk about the experience, because obviously, he kills the officer at the start by crashing into the truck, and he has the other officer light himself on fire, he gives birth to a heart attack. The only character who really talks about what it's like to experience being under Modell's control is Holly, and she sort of talks about it where she's, suddenly I was watching myself from across the room doing these things. It's like he was inside my head, and it's very much a violation of her bodily autonomy and her control, and, like, her choices, her ability to choose, and it's him asserting his right to control that, and that plays into, like, a recurring theme throughout the third season as a whole. Like, obviously, going back to Paperclip, where you find out that, like, Bill Mulder decided that Samantha would be taken rather than Mulder, but even stuff like Scully meeting the women in Nicey and 731, Lucy Householder, for example, in Oubliette, this idea of, like, control over a person's body, and they're, like, denying them their choices and denying them like their autonomy, which is an interesting way of doing that within a narrative that is relatively standalone, because Pusher obviously has nothing to do with the larger mythology as a whole. It's got nothing to do with the Smoking Man, nothing to do with the government conspiracy, no mention of aliens or little green men or anything like that, black oil or whatever, but it still touches on these little recurring fascinations that simmer throughout the season in a way that is interesting. It's fascinating how they sort of seem to bubble through, even in scripts that aren't, like, Gilligan at this point, this was his first script as a regular writer on the show, having been hired. He got sick, I believe, early in the season, and so he was very generously allowed to write a late stage script, a script that was going to be late in the production order. And in fact, like, he's talked about how scared he was writing Pusher, because the X-Files had a very high attrition rate when it came to writers, and in fact it had a very high attrition rate when it came to writers up until the 5th season, where the show famously was described as having a revolving door when it came to hiring people on staff. So, like, this is sort of Gilligan's first script, and it's one of the scripts, you know, it's one with a very strong authorial voice, but it's very interesting that it still feels of a piece with the show around it. It's really fascinating how, like, despite the fact it is a standalone episodic story, it still belongs in this season. It's remarkable.
One thing about the Holly sequence that you mentioned that struck me today, and I've never thought of this before, and maybe I'm just thinking too deeply into it, but obviously, you know, that sequence is when, you know, Modell goes to the FBI in order to look up some details on Mulder in order to continue playing his game. Writes pass on a on a piece of paper to get past, which I love. And, you know, he gets into the FBI, and then he makes Holly, this, you know, FBI worker, attack Skinner and beat Skinner up. But what struck me was that Skinner isn't affected by him. Now, I found that I'd never noticed this before, but surely he could have put the whammy on Skinner at that point, and he didn't necessarily. Was it that he was too busy controlling Holly, and that he couldn't control, you know, Mel Cooley, as he calls him, or is Skinner so masculine?
Skinner's masculinity trumps all masculinity.
Exactly, that he's just like, I'm not taking any of this shit, you know, I don't care what you can do, you know, I'm Skinner, I'm Walter Skinner, you get out of my office.
I'm just waiting for the moment like the cigarette-smoking man in Paperclip, where Modell tries to put the whammy on Skinner and realises that it's just not working.
Oh, yeah, exactly. And I don't know, it just struck me that it made me wonder why Skinner actually wasn't affected by him. And like I say, maybe I'm just reading too much into it.
Well, this is one of the things where, like, and again, keep in mind, I want to remind you, Tony, before I say what I'm about to say, that I gave it a 10 at the start of the episode, and I love it, and it's one of my top 10 episodes of all time. I adore it. I think it's fantastic.
I sense a big butt coming.
And I cannot lie. You other brothers can't deny. But one of the things about Pusher, and I get the sense that this is maybe, like, you know, it is an early Gilligan script. It's a fantastic script. It's a perfect script. There are writers who will not write a script this good and have been writing in television for, you know, up to 50 years, right? Just so we're clear on this, as a starting point for the observation that I'm about to make, Tony.
Don't upset me, Darren. It's my birthday.
But there is a certain looseness about Pusher that if I were, and this is interesting because I'm not, as a critic, in inverted commas, I'm not really a critic, but as a critic or as somebody who, like, observes popular culture, I'm not generally bothered by, like, plot holes and by internal logic gaps or whatever. I'm generally, as long as a piece of entertainment is fast enough, clever enough, and smooth enough, I'll forgive everything. And I think there's an argument to be made, one of my colleagues has made it before, that, like, if you're reaching the point where you're watching The Dark Knight Rises and you're going, well, how did Batman get back to Gotham? The issue isn't that Christopher Nolan didn't explain to you how Batman, the master detective who spent a third of his first film wandering around the globe, how he managed to sneak back to Gotham despite being a billionaire. The issue is not that Nolan failed to explain this to you. The issue is that you're out of the story and you've started noticing and picking at these little plot holes, right? So I say this as a preface to, like, I never really noticed these until I watched it a couple of hundred times, but the script to Pusher does have some issues that if you were a plot hole orientated critic, if you were somebody who demanded that your narrative be absolutely 110% airtight, and by the way, to be clear, like, when I say 110% airtight, that's beyond criticism. This is the kind of people who go to Back to the Future, the film that we pointed to earlier as a film that is taught in, like, film school as the perfect script, and goes, Yeah, but why is the teenager hanging around with an 80-year-old mad scientist? That's sort of killjoy, right?
Yeah,
but if you were that sort of killjoy and you were to apply that logic to Pusher, you would have a number of questions, such as, how exactly does Modell's power work, right? He writes pass on a piece of paper, sticks it in his jacket pocket, right? If his ability to control people is governed by his voice, as the rest of the episode implies, how does that work to people who he's not talking to? Surely, there are people at the corridor noticing this guy wandering around with pass written in his lapel and going, isn't that a bit strange? Maybe I should let security know without talking to him directly. Similarly, the issue with Skinner is another example of that, where it's like, well, why doesn't he just put the whammy on Skinner? And Holly is perhaps an example of that as well, where Holly's convenient injury and backstory that's foreshadowed earlier that just happens to come into play later on in the episode is maybe a little bit convenient. I don't think these are issues. I don't think these are problems. But I do think, and being honest, I think that if the script went to the bother of explaining these, if it slowed down to say Skinner, oh yeah, I was at the firing range and I left my earring pieces in or whatever, or I just wasn't really focusing on what he was saying. If you stopped to explain them, you'd kill the momentum of the episode. And so I don't mind that these things aren't explained because you can follow and intuit them logically enough. But there are certain gaps in there. I don't think this is Gilligan's most tightly constructed script in terms of plot holes and in terms of logic, but I don't think that's an issue. I think it's fantastically constructed otherwise.
Yeah, I completely agree. I absolutely agree, and I think really, you could apply that factor if you were going to be one of those people who looks for plot holes. You could apply it to most episodes of the X-Files. In terms of how things quite work and how things sync up, and some of the explanations for things. I think by its very nature, it's intentionally not going to fill every single gap for you, which is probably one of the reasons that gasp shock horror. There are actually people out there who don't like the X-Files.
Who are these people, Tony?
Well, I don't talk to them, but I know they exist. But they would point to that. They point to those aspects. So no, I completely agree with that, and I think it doesn't bother me that Skinner's not affected. I just think it makes Skinner even more badass, to be honest. But I think I tell you what, the other thing that struck me as well, just on this point. Again, I'm probably reading too much into it, but the moment when you first see Holly and it sets up the fact later on that she's Pusher's saying he's the guy who mugged you, that whole thing did make me wonder that is that really what happened to Holly? Or was she a victim of domestic violence? Because it looks almost like she's been punched, in that sense. And I could not but wonder, because it was a strange little exchange, with Mulder and Scully. So I don't know whether you would agree with this, and I might be reaching, but could it be that might have been a little bit of a subtext, even though the mugging is mentioned? Could it be that there's a little bit of a comment on masculinity in that sense as well? In that maybe Holly is a victim of that kind of, violent toxic masculinity, and she's kind of covering that up at work.
Well, I think it definitely. I don't know if that particular subtext is intended or there. I can sort of see it when you mention it like that, because I think that Holly's primary function in the narrative is to serve as an example of a victim of the people who are hurt by this toxic masculinity in a way that isn't he set himself on fire, he got crushed by a car, he had a heart attack. This is somebody who lives with the violence and sort of carries it with her, and it's one of the most affecting scenes in the episode where Holly is crying to Skinner and explaining, and by the way, and explaining what it felt like to have him inside her head, which is something that I think a lot of people and maybe a lot of women as well who are victims of, as he pointed out, domestic abuse and domestic violence can probably empathize with. This idea of having an abuser who is in your head, who is not necessarily literally in there, but you can feel them in there, and you have that sort of horrible sort of sense that your life is not your own, and it's a really moving and really uncomfortable and really unsettling scene, because then you have Skinner, who is and again, Skinner is, you point about maybe Skinner overwhelmed him with the sheer force of his masculinity. I'm not joking there. Skinner's masculinity is presented as benign, and Skinner's masculinity is idealized, because when people say, and this is something that gets people back up when you talk about toxic masculinity, because people are like, oh man, that means you couldn't have people like Clint Eastwood, you couldn't have real men anymore. And you're like, look at Skinner. Skinner is the realest man I know. And his response to Holly's situation is basically to bustle all the people who have to be there out of there as soon as humanly possible in order to give her the space that she needs. He's considerate, he's compassionate. This is a woman who is, as he points out, he has a size 8 heel mark on his face as a result of this. But his first response is compassionate. It's understated. You know, he doesn't comfort her explicitly, but he also makes a point not to turn her suffering into a public spectacle. Like, there's a sense that Skinner is, like, the perfect man. And I know this is something that other people in this podcast will be very happy to hear, but yes, Skinner is pretty close to the perfect, like, the ideal form of masculinity or expression of masculinity. And I think that there is something very, very, you know, it's very touching and it's very effective, the way that it's used in relation to Holly's experiences. Because they are deeply, deeply unsettling. I think that, like, as much as the scene where the guy lights himself on fire is really horrible to watch, and the scene with the heart attack with Burst is really claustrophobic and intense, like, actually hearing Holly account for it, in many ways it reminds me of Jessica Jones. Remember Jessica Jones?
Yes, I love Jessica Jones. Yeah, it's a great show.
But it has a similar sort of vibe to it. And it's ironic that, like, Modell is dressed in blue. But it does have that sort of same vibe to it. That same sort of, like, theme of violation and that theme of, like, oppression and that theme of violence that is not actual, you know, that is not necessarily physical violence, but is instead psychological violence. And it's really horrible.
I mean, it's funny you should mention Jessica Jones, because I remember when I was, you know, watching that, and I did a piece about it. I think it's second season on my blog. You know, I've talked about how I think the character of Kilgrave in Jessica Jones, and if anyone's watched that, you know, he's the villain in the first season, played by David Tennant, probably one of the best Marvel villains they've ever done on screen. He is essentially Pusher. You know, it's the same sort of idea. You know, it's this idea of somebody pushing their will onto someone else. He is more of a literal sort of comic book supervillain than Pusher is. You know, obviously because it's a comic book, you know, adaptation. But it is more accentuated to the abusive that he's done to Jessica Jones and he's perpetrated onto her than the Pusher story is. But it's essentially the same, you know, idea, and it's just been done in a different format. So I think there is something to that, and I think I'm not saying that the alias Jessica Jones or Kilgrave essentially was exactly influenced by Pusher, but I think the same idea sort of floats around in that it is about this abuse of power in many respects and this control of people, you know. And in Pusher, it's that I think the stuff with Holly is the most understated and some of the most fascinating, you know, especially given we've talked about it here in this episode. And it's not always the stuff that people focus on. People often, understandably, focus on Frank Burst's death or the guy setting himself on fire and all these kind of things, and the Russian roulette scene at the end. But it's these subtleties, I think, that really make Pusher, when you look at it deeply, so much more interesting.
Yeah, I would agree with that entirely. Like, I mean, I think you're right when you focus in on Jessica Jones there, because there are a lot of parallels there. In particular, like, one of the things in Jessica Jones, they talk about, like, the Purple Man Kilgrave, is basically they say that the worst thing about it is how his voice makes you want to help him. And like, there's a moment early in Pusher where your man finds him at the golf club, and it's a beautiful shot sequence by Rob Bowman. His mouth, like, at the point Modell's mouth is just barely visible out of silhouette, which underscores, like, this is his superpower. But it's like, can you help me with something? And the implication is that, like, it's not just that he forces you to do something, it's that he makes some part of you want to do it. It's like that there is some aspect of him, not just, like, controlling your body, but, like, forcing his will onto you and making you basically an extension of himself, which is horrifying and unsettling. And I think, like, it's worth pointing out, again, The X-Files was a show that aired in prime time, like, on Fox, like, you know, there were limits with what you could do. You couldn't necessarily talk about things like sexual abuse, up front. Like, we talked about, like, on the pod watch Irresistible, where Donnie Pfaster had to be a death fetishist, because they couldn't say necrophiliac on screen, for example. So you can't always articulate these ideas, like, in the most explicit manner possible. But they are there, and I think they're very definitely there in a way that is unsettling, uncanny, and very effective. Like, my skin crawls. It isn't just that my pulse, quickens watching it. It's a suspense thriller that's fantastic constructed. There is something more unsettling and skin crawly about what Modell does that kind of lingers with you after or underneath stuff like the bit where he talks Burst into having a heart attack, which is just like Hitchcock level suspense.
Well, yeah, and that scene is really horrifying in the sort of really sort of horrendously dark comedy that Modell, in the way he does it, when he says your heart flatlines, beep, and it's really twisted. It's like he's having fun. Well, he is having fun. He's taking pleasure out of this, horrible, bone-chilling, act. I mean, it is one of the best things I've ever seen on the X-Files. That sequence, it's tense anyway because you've got Mulder, shouting, stop it, stop the call, and all this kind of thing. Then Burst is determined to get something that in the end means nothing, the trace number. And it's the way then he goes, oh yeah, there's the number, 055, and just the look on everyone's face and the music and, everything about it is just this sheer sort of cold-blooded, oh my God, this guy is evil, if you really want to draw that kind of word out of it. But the whole sequence of that it has such dark level of morbid humour that we're not finding funny. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that it's funny. I'm saying that Modell finds it funny, and that makes him even more chilling in that respect. And it really sets off he's already a really tense, brilliantly executed murder. And one of the most inventive I've ever seen. It just sets that whole scene off, I think, and really underscores how much of a villain this guy is. And then, leads towards the ending where you just really want to see him get his comeuppance. Especially by this point, I think.
Yeah, I mean, like, one of my own personal favourite line from that really tense sequence is, I bet you shake on that salt like a maraca. Which is like, God, yeah. And you can tell that, like, you imagine, like, writing that, Gilligan's like, boom, got it, nailed it. And it's like, it's a line you hear in the background of the scene while something horrific is happening. And you're like, oh boy. It's so well constructed. And again, this is the kind of thing where you have this idea of Modell not believing that other people are actually people. They're just props. They're instruments for his own story, for his own satisfaction and gratification. They exist so that he can have the story that he wants to have, and anything that happens in between is pretty much it's incidental. In some ways, you could argue he's like a television writer. It's like as soon as like the Mulder character shows up, and suddenly he's obsessed with him because he's very interested in Burst at the start. He's like, I love your name, and he knows Burst ahead of time, and he rings up Burst, and he's playing cat and mouse games with Burst. But it's like as soon as Mulder shows up, Modell's like, okay, I'm trading up. It's like, okay, it's like, all of a sudden I'm not starring in like a Steven Seagal action movie. Now I'm starring in like a Brad Pitt, like, psycho thriller movie. This is like, okay, new game coming up. And it's like, you can tell that he's literally just like, I'm done with Burst. It's like, I've had my fun with him. He no longer has any purpose in this narrative that I'm doing, so I'll just write him off for no reason, because, this episode needs like a third act twist. And part of me wonders if this is like Gilligan having, like, is Gilligan being, because Gilligan later on obviously he does episodes like X-Cops, he does episodes like Drive, which opens with the Fox News chase. There's like, Gilligan scripts have this element of like self-awareness and metafiction to them, and part of me wonders if like Pusher isn't in some ways like a commentary on like the callousness of writers in like this broad existential sense. This whole, is it kill your darlings? That sort of philosophy where you write these characters and you're in control of their lives and you build little stories out of them. And in many cases, if you are a writer trying to tell a story, you have to do horrible, horrible things to your creations. And I mean, obviously, like Westworld does something similar, for example, with its own hosts or whatever. But part of me wonders if Modell isn't like, in some tiny way, Gilligan kind of playing with the idea that maybe being a writer is a bit like being a sociopath, except instead of actually treating other people like they're props, you create other people from scratch and treat them like they're props. And part of me sort of wonders if there isn't something a little bit kind of cheeky and wry in basically Modell as a writer within his own story.
It could be a sort of meta commentary on that, really, and I think by the conclusion of the story, which is obviously after Burst dies, they get the link to Fairfax Mercy Pharmacy and Fairfax Hospital, which is where the big Russian roulette climax goes down. I think it's one of those sort of, it's almost like this perfect sort of climax of this kind of story, in that Modell wants to see Mulder kill the one person that he loves the most. And that's the other thing. There's I think Modell very quickly starts to understand that there is this bond, this Holmes-Watson bond between Mulder and Scully, because at the start, he makes a sort of suggestive comment that they might be more than friends and that they mean a lot to each other, that Mulder and Scully just sort of ignore. But then by the end, the whole setup of that, once he puts the whammy on Mulder and he gets him set up in the Russian roulette scene, it's only when Scully arrives that the game can really begin.
I love that whammy is the technical description of his power. It's like, yep, he laid the whammy on him.
It's the whammy.
I like to think that's Mulder's official X-File report. Like, Skinner's sitting there going, what is the whammy?
Yeah, what's the whammy? Exactly. And that's it. The game really begins when Scully gets to that, to that hospital. And by this point, I think it's worth briefly pointing out how amazing Robert Wisdom is as Modell as well, as Pusher. I think his performance is just astonishingly good all the way through this. He gets this character completely, and I think he's already extremely well written, but this is one of those examples where the actor really takes what's there and create something else as well.
Yeah, Wisdom is astounding here. And in fact, it's telling that Modell is one of the handful of Monsters of the Week who got a second episode. So obviously, Toombs got one in the first season and Donny Faster comes back in the 7th season. But Modell is I think, Modell is basically, he's one of those very few select characters who gets brought back. And Wisdom is one of those actors who he's very good overall. And he's had a very long career, very long distinguished career. Like, for example, I was the only person in the cinema who punched my fist into the air when I was watching Watchmen and realised that he was playing Richard Nixon in it. But he's also popped up I think he popped up a couple of times in Millennium as well, for example. I think he played the principal in the episode Monster in the early 2nd season, which is very good as well. But yeah, he's never been better. I haven't seen him be better than he is here, because he's really, really, really good. He captures, and I think when you talked about that opening scene, where immediately, you don't know what he's done, you don't know what he's capable of doing, but just watching this guy wander through a supermarket, he's an asshole. And Wisdom just captures that beautifully. And Wisdom does this thing with Modell where, and again, it's something it's obviously there in Gilligan's script, but it's so perfectly embodied in Wisdom's performance, where Modell is at once this horrible, reprehensible, monstrous human being, but you look at him and he's also very pathetic, and you also kind of, some part of you feels almost sorry that this is the closest thing that he will ever do to anything that matters, even though it's costing all these lives and he's hurting all these innocent people. There's something he's never, as threatening as he is in a psychological sense and in terms of what he can do, he's also very pathetic. He's also very, you look at him and you feel this measure of almost pity for what he is, which is a remarkable balance to strike in a performance like this, where he literally tells a man to set himself on fire. It's wonderful work. Yeah,
it really is. Although it wasn't supposed to be him originally.
I remember this. Yeah.
It was Lance Henriksen was considered for this part, just because this was in the pre-production for Millennium's first season, and obviously Henriksen plays Frank Black in that show. But I mean, Henriksen's a brilliant actor, don't get me wrong, but you wouldn't have got this same performance and this same kind of dynamic had he played that role.
He would have seemed more world weary. I think with Modell, you get the sense that he's doing it because he's never amounted to anything. Whereas if you cast Lance Henriksen in the role, you'd almost get a sense that he's doing it because he's bored. You get a sense that, if Lance Henriksen was playing the character, it would almost feel like, well, this character has probably been through more than I will experience in my entire life, and has discovered that he can control people's minds. So I guess he's just doing whatever interests him. Good for him.
Yeah, I think Wisdom's, it's one of those performances where you just can't imagine anyone else as Pusher, and that's one of those great things. Can you name, I'm going to have a little bit of an X-quiz moment here. Can you name the cameo in Pusher, however, Darren?
Oh, this is one of the things where I've somehow never spotted it, but I know it exists because everybody knows that it exists. It's Dave Grohl.
Dave Grohl of the Nirvana and the Foo Fighters, who... had
he's in the FBI, isn't he? In the FBI building, sorry.
He is. No, yes, he is. He's in the FBI building with his then wife in the background, because he's a big fan of UFO lore, understandably, given that he called his band the Foo Fighters. So yeah, he was a fan of the X-Files, so he's there. Or it is very much blink and you'll miss it though with him. Like it really is. Like he's barely there. It's a cool little cameo. Interestingly though, as well, one thing that, going back to the FBI sequence and just quickly back to the Skinner and Holly stuff, is that Mitch Pileggi wasn't happy with this. He wasn't happy with Skinner getting beat up. He thought that it had happened too much already, which I think he got a fair point by this point.
I'm just remembering the story from, was it Colony and Endgame, where Rob Bowman was directing, I think it was Endgame, or the second part of that two-parter, where himself and Stephen Williams were throwing down, and Mitch Pileggi, and Bowman was like, I think you guys can do better, and they went through the back wall of the set on that take. And part of me sort of imagining, like, Pileggi I can see why Pileggi would feel that way about this episode.
And I think it was less for him about, not being angry that Skinner was getting beat up, Skinner's masculine and all this. I don't think it was that. I think he was just fed up of, because this is an episode after he's just been shot as well, if I remember rightly, in like Piper Maru and Apocrypha. So I think he's been shot, he's been beaten up, everything's kind of happened to him. And I imagine this is probably one of the reasons that, next season he gets to kick the 7 bells out of Krychek. It's just like, this is my turn.
Repaying 26 episodes of like suffering on Krychek. Probably makes a bit of sense as well. Yeah. I mean, like, It's one of those things, and I suspect it's the reality of like television production when you're producing 26 episodes a year, is you eventually develop like these writer crutches. I mean, Spotnitz has talked about how in the second season he wasn't happy with how frequently Gillian Anderson was put in peril, because he found that the writers were doing that. And like he said himself, if he was writing his own scripts in the late second season and he'd been cognizant or he'd had time to think about it, he wouldn't have written them that way. So I think maybe it is a result of like the demands of production of television, where it's literally like, you have to get this script out in X amount of time. So don't think too much about how it relates to, like, in minor detail, the other episodes of the season. Just get it done and get it in front of the cameras. Although I do like that now I'm imagining, now my headcanon is basically that the anesthetic hadn't worn off from his surgery, and that's why Modell couldn't control him. It's like Kilgrave and Jessica Jones, where they spend 3 episodes in the first season. I love Jessica Jones, but they spend 3 episodes in the first season discovering that Kilgrave's secret weakness is anesthetic. And it's like, everybody's secret weakness is anesthetic. But I like the idea that Pusher's secret weakness is other people on anesthetic.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, it's one of those things where you just go, oh dear. But yeah, we're gonna wrap up anyway. The in-depth talk. We'll come back a little bit to the Russian roulette scene, but let's get into some listener feedback before we go, because it'd be interesting to see what you guys made of Pusher. So listener feedback. From you guys. We've got loads on Pusher. I'm probably not going to be able to read all of it, but thank you to everyone who has commented. I think there's a lot of love for Pusher out there. I don't think anyone in the X-Cast Basement group on Facebook, which is where we asked for your opinion, said they didn't like Pusher. So you're all still my friends, and you're welcome in the group at any point. But one of my favourite comments to start off with was from Katie Doe, who said that strangely, Pusher has one of my favourite lines of the series. It's got a core uranium or some damn thing. I don't know what. Gets up there like Sputnik. Which is where Pusher is taking the swing of the golf course. And he's like, "Konnichiwa, gentlemen. I was never here."
That whole sequence is so wonderfully 90s.
Yeah.
You have Mulder making an O.J. Simpson joke beforehand, where he's like a killer and a golfer. Where have we heard that before?
Yeah,
but you also have that sort of like 90s obsession with like Japanese business in the US. Like you obviously that you saw in like 731 and Nicey, where like American pop culture was weirdly fixated on like Japanese economic success. So of course Modell is demonstrating golf to a bunch of Japanese businessmen on a golf club saying konnichiwa. But yeah, I love that sequence. It's one of those things where you can tell that Modell wants an audience. Like he's a storyteller. He wants basically people, he wants attention and he wants to feel important. So even when he's doing mundane stuff like hitting a fucking golf ball, it's like, I demand an audience appreciate how awesome I am doing this thing. And it's like, okay. But it taps into what makes the character so great, so scary, and so pathetic at the same time.
But exactly, it's those sort of villainous quirks, isn't it? It's those little moments that you get, in these kind of stories that just add that little extra bit of flavour. I love that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think it's a great line. Maura Function Jaeger says that the scene between Modell, Mulder and Scully in the hospital is among the most riveting and superbly acted ones of the entire series. I entirely agree, Maura. That desperate look that Mulder gives Scully when pleading with her to run, the restraint he musters for her but not himself, it was such a moving example of how much she means to him. And that single tear in Scully's eye, the shock on Modell's face when Mulder turns the gun on him, phenomenal. I think that's spot on, really, because the power and the emotion in that sequence, then that Russian roulette sequence, that whole Scully run moment is you just feel it. Every time I watch it, I just get goosebumps at that whole sequence, and every time I watch it, I still worry that he's going to pull that trigger on Scully. It's just brilliantly executed.
It is, and again, we've talked about how great Winston is. Duchovny is fantastic here as well. Yeah. I mean, Anderson is fantastic as well, but Duchovny is just clearly relishing having and again, he's really good. Duchovny is fantastic when he's really invested in a script, and you can tell he's actually really invested in this one as well. That sequence is fingernails in your palm sort of tense. It's amazing.
Yeah, no, it is. Oh my God, just pure tension. Karen McKenna says, whenever I'm put on the spot to pick a favourite episode, this is the one I always seem to default to. Wise choice, Karen. Picking favourites with this series is such an impossible task, but I've been in love with Pusher since the first time it aired. Modell is such a fantastic villain, and his power is one of the most interesting and dangerous we've seen on the show. It's a fun game of cat and mouse with wonderful and emotional character moments. David and Gillian are both at the top of their game on this one, and Robert Wisden really sells Modell as simultaneously frightening and sympathetic. The writer-director team up of Vince Gilligan and Rob Bowman is a sight to behold, and the whole thing just comes together as this wonderful, cohesive whole. I just love it so much. We haven't really talked about Rob Bowman, I suppose. So let's briefly talk about him, because he's sort of the unsung hero of this. Because while Gilligan's script is fantastic, the performances, especially by Wisden and Duchovny, are terrific. Bowman's direction, and we've talked before on the Xcast about how Bowman's episodes always stand out. That they've got that certain cinematic style to them. They've got a real sense of sort of power to them in many ways, and just the way he films things, the way he shoots things. I think he does a great job on this, and I'd say it's less sort of visually sumptuous as some of his other episodes, but I think he really holds it all together really well.
Well, I mean, when I think of Pusher, I think of that shot of Pusher hiding out in the golf club with his face in silhouette and his mouth visible, which is a wonderful framing choice. But it's also editing. The thing about Bowman for me, and I can only speak for my own personal preferences here, what distinguishes Bowman as an X-Files director from, say, obviously R.W. Goodwin or any of the other great directors who've worked on the show. I mean, even Chris Carter, for example, Duchovny is another great director as well. But I mean, the thing that distinguishes Bowman is his sense of propulsive movement. And it's very telling that, his other big collaboration with Gilligan is Drive, or one of his other big collaborations with Gilligan is an episode literally called Drive, about characters who have to keep moving or their heads will explode. Because he has this sense of, propulsive movement through his scripts, through his episodes, where the editing is incredibly tight. The framing is very clear. It's always clear where characters are in relation to one another, but there's always this mounting sense of dread building and sort of a tempo rising. The burst sequence is fantastic. It's wonderfully claustrophobic. And I mean, you've had a moment earlier where the camera takes you through the apartment, so you know the geography of the apartment, but it's just this guy talking on a phone, but it's so incredibly well edited. It's so perfectly put together in terms of the sound, in terms of the mix, in terms of the visual, in terms of how the camera is staring at this actor's face, just watching the pressure mount as this voice is sort of the voice isn't there, it isn't overdubbed, it's on a phone, so it's filtered, but you're getting the impression you're hearing it in the background, because that's less important than watching the reaction on the actor's face. Bowman's sense of his storytelling is amazing, and it's not a knock on the other fantastic X-Files directors that Bowman was the one who was eventually pegged to work on, obviously, Fight the Future. But Bowman's style is perhaps the most overtly, traditionally cinematic, and I'm actually a bit disappointed that Bowman never quite transitioned to the big screen, because obviously he did like Reign of Fire, for example, I think, if I remember correctly, which is the Matthew McConaughey, Christian Bale dragon film, which is much better than Matthew McConaughey, Christian Bale dragon film would lead you to believe that it is. And it's actually, I was quite... he had some bad experiences, I think, with... was it which was the one, the teenage thriller that he did? But anyway, he basically moved back to television, and he worked on Castle, where he's one of the big directors there and executive producer. And I'm actually quite disappointed that he never really sort of like became a feature film director, primarily, because I feel like he would have been very, very good at it. And I think that Pusher is just it's not showy in the way that, you know, other mythology episodes like Paperclip or like 731 or Nicey are, but it's still propulsive. It still moves, and it's still like, from a visual, from an aural standpoint, from like what a director does on a television show standpoint, it is meticulously put together.
Yeah, and it's the kind of thing that works partly because it's got a firm hand on the rudder. You know, it's got someone who knows what they're doing. So you can see that with Bowman. So yeah, I completely agree with that. One other major piece of feedback from Matt Latham, which I mentioned briefly before. It's a fairly long one, this, but I think it's worth reading because it taps into something I thought was a really interesting point. Matt Latham says, I know you've called Modell Mulder's closest thing to Moriarty. It's one of the few times the show has really given Mulder an equal foe that challenges him and keeps him on his feet. A criticism I'll give the show as a whole is that I don't think Mulder's had a genuine recurring nemesis on the level of Moriarty and the Joker are to Holmes and Batman. I don't think you can throw the cigarette smoking man here as the relationship between him and Mulder is a less straight out arch nemesis, but more as an obstacle to the truth that he has surprisingly few scenes with. I suppose that's true. As the series goes on, their relationship becomes more frustrating than exciting. The closest we get is Krycek. His first few appearances feel like he's an equal match for Mulder, but he then develops into a bit of a stooge who I think is only there to show what would happen if Mulder was in it for the material gain rather than emotional closure. He also feels like he's gradually becoming a bumbling henchman than a genuine threat. Again, I think that's fair, really.
That's very on point. I agree with that.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think we've talked in this podcast before about how Krycek is just crap. He's just crap at everything he does. As great as Pusher is, it's an episode that highlights just how entertaining Mulder is when he's got someone who's one-upping him and causing him to improvise on the fly. He's got a habit of coming across as a bit of an arrogant know-it-all who can occasionally look down on those around him. But when he's brought down a peg or two by a genuine immediate threat, and not some bloke in a suit smirking in the shadows, and having it to rethink things on the fly, it shows his strengths in a more positive light. Now, I think that's an interesting point there, because he talks a lot about the villainy and this counterpart to Mulder. But I think when we talked a little bit about it afterwards in the thread, and one of my points was that the X-Files isn't necessarily a show which operates in the same sort of sense as other series where there is a villain each year, and it's not quite that same thing. It doesn't do that. It's not set up in that same way. I made the point that if we ever get a reboot of the X-Files, a modern reboot, filmed in a modern sensibility, I could well imagine a character like Pusher being a recurring villain for a different kind of Mulder. So I think he makes an interesting point about how Mulder is in relation to Modell in this episode. What do you think about what he said there, Darren? Because I'm interested to get your viewpoint on this.
It's kind of interesting because, you both kind of compared Pusher to Moriarty. Moriarty is an absolutely fascinating character because he dominates the Holmes mythology to an absurd degree, to the point where the entire first Sherlock Holmes movie starring Robert Downey Jr. seemed to be building towards the promise that the sequel would feature Moriarty. But the thing about Moriarty is he actually appears in very, very few of the Sir Arthur Conan Doyle stories, despite becoming such an outsized opponent, despite having such a large role in the mythos. So it is kind of interesting in that sense. And I think that even when you look at other adaptations of the Sherlock Holmes mythos, so for example Elementary, where I think Moriarty was played by Natalie Dormer, or even the Sherlock where she's played by what's his name, I'm going to feel really bad that I missed this because one of my friends is a big fan of his, Andrew
Scott. I think.
Andrew Scott, yes, the Irish actor Andrew Scott. Even in those adaptations of the narrative, Moriarty tends to be a finite threat rather than a pure recurring force. So, like, obviously, he's almost, as soon as he's revealed in Sherlock, he's done away with, pretty much. And I think even when you get to Elementary, Dormer was basically a one-season villain, because one assumes in part because she was busy off becoming, a massive star, but also in part because I think that one of the things about Moriarty is that, like, Moriarty is in some senses like a final boss. It's like the ultimate opponent for a character. I don't think Moriarty, despite being such an iconic part of the Holmes mythos, can really be sustainable as like a long-running recurring foe. And I think that Matt's correct when he says, like, the closest thing Mulder has to a recurring foil is the cigarette-smoking man. And he's also quite correct when he says that eventually the dynamic becomes more frustrating than compelling. And part of me wonders if that's something that's, like, true of all characters on that scale, where if you have a villain who so ridiculously outmatches the hero. And, like, it's different if you have a villain who is on par with the hero, or who is competing with the hero, or is on a level playing field with the hero. So, for example, I think of, Gul Dukat on Deep Space Nine, who for 5 seasons was basically Sisko's foil, the lead character's foil. Except they were never directly antagonistic with each other, and Dukat was just as likely to be going through a really crap phase of his life as he was to be on top of it all. And it kind of, like, it worked, and it kept the dynamic sort of fresh. I think if you have a character who's positioned as an arch enemy of a character, it's very hard to maintain a level of consistent threat across a sustained period of time with them. Now, I mean, you can obviously point to counterexamples, like, for example, Batman and the Joker, who have been, the line in The Dark Knight where the Joker says, "I feel like we'll be doing this forever," which is really sad given what happened to Heath Ledger, but which embodies the dynamic between them. But, like, you look at that and you think that there are periods in the character's history where the Joker has been, like, a bum note, where everyone's been like, "Oh no, not another frickin' Joker story." And every once in a while you get stories like The Dark Knight, or like Scott Snyder's Black Mirror, or even, the couple of the Grant Morrison's use of the Joker in, like, in his own arcs. But those work because they're basically reinventions of the character in a certain sense. There's an aspect of which I think if you have an arch enemy who is meant to constantly be a threat to the lead character, you have, like, one of two scenarios. You can either let that story play out to its conclusion, which is why you tend to have, like, modern shows will do, like, season arcs, and maybe you could do a season arc where Pusher was the bad guy. Or you have it in a situation where the hero continuously either beats the villain or survives by the skin of their teeth, which, if you run that over a set period of years, becomes the same as beating the villain, which is what happens to the cigarette-smoking man on the X-Files, but what happens to, say, the Borg on Voyager, where what was once meant to be, like, an overwhelming opponent who, presented a real challenge against which the heroes could not possibly triumph, but inexplicably do repeatedly, you undercut them somewhat. So, I mean, I could see maybe at a push a season arc building towards a final confrontation with Modell as, like, an X-Files, like, if you were doing, like, a modern, like, 10-episode, like, semi-serialized X-Files show. But I certainly couldn't see, like, a 7-year run where Modell is lurking in the shadows, or, coming face-to-face with Mulder for extended periods of that.
I think it definitely wouldn't work in the style of the X-Files as we know it. Now, it's absolutely. So I think that's very true. We'll give the final word before we go to Carl Sweeney, one of the regular co-hosts of the X-Cast, and he says probably the most succinct thing about Pusher that I've read. He simply says, "It's a promising dry run for Kitsunegari." So, cheers, Carl. Thanks for that. Thanks for that searing
I feel like we
analysis.
really shouldn't have topped out our ratings on Pusher. I feel like we probably should have held something back. I have a soft spot for Kitsunegiri.
So do I, to be fair.
It won't be a 10. Let's just get that out there now. But I have a soft spot for it.
I do. I think there's a lot about it. I'm looking forward to doing it when we get there, actually, because I think there's a lot about it. I think it's underrated a little bit. It is no Pusher, however, but then what is? So this has been a fantastic discussion. Everything I wanted for my birthday, Darren. So thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks, Tony. That's been an absolute joy for me as well. I feel like maybe I've gone on a bit, but thank you very much. This was an absolute pleasure.
Not at all. Not at all. I think we've got under the skin of Pusher in a really fascinating way. We've pushed each other into into some great stuff. So,
will this be a model episode? Model episode?
I tell you what, we know how to do these puns, don't we? I think we've got this down to a fine art now. We really do.
We've imparted a great deal of wisdom here.
That's it. Drop the mic, Matt, Darren. We're done. Okay. And before we go, as you drop that mic, tell us where people can find more of what you're up to.
I write at the Movie Blog, which is my own website. It's spelt like the Movie Blog, but with a 0 instead of an O in movie, because I didn't get there fast enough. Where I post reviews of popular culture, so lots of movie reviews coming out. Lots of television. I'm dissecting Star Trek Voyager at the moment. And I also co-host a podcast, The 250, with my good friend Andrew Quinn, where we pick a movie at random from the IMDb's Top 250 movies and talk about that for a little while every week. So that's out every Saturday. We did, obviously, as you mentioned, thank you very much earlier on, Yojimbo. So we discussed like Mulder's great samurai film. Unfortunately, I didn't manage to turn that into a 2-hour discussion of Pusher, despite my best efforts. My co-host kept me on point, I'm afraid. But it's if you are interested, you can check that out. I also co-host a weekly podcast looking at the world of film, international and Irish, the Scanon podcast, which you can find by Googling. It's the Irish for film. If people are looking for a fun, trivial fact about Ireland and or film, Scanon is the Irish word for film.
Excellent. All great stuff. When do we get the Svengali movie covered? Which we saw in
Modell's
Pusher.
watching on television. Which is, it's one of those things where it's like the episode, like if the tone weren't balanced perfectly, that would seem cheesy, but everything is so perfectly on point that it's like, I'm with this. This is like a comic book supervillain story that where the villain seems to have left his TV on watching Svengali, so it will happen to cut right to the villain's eyes at the point where Mulder and Scully walk through the door. It's like, I am all over this. It's like,
perfect.
Boom, sold. The only way they could top this is to make a sequel where people cover themselves in blue paint, but they'll never do that.
They'll never do that. That would be as ridiculous as a fox hunt, wouldn't it? Really crazy idea. It's go and check all that great stuff about Darren out, guys, and you'll be back very soon anyway, because you're back to talk about Hell Money next week. Which is a very, very different episode, but I think you're a big fan of that, aren't you? It's not one that everybody loves, but I think you're going to change a few minds on this.
Darren's crazy opinion corner. Bring your tinfoil hats and your unpopular opinions. It's going to be great fun. It's going to be great fun.
Your minds are going to be blown.
Yeah, I honestly do love the episode, although I acknowledge that it may not be a lot of people's cup of tea, and also B, it has some very serious issues with cultural sensitivity. But on the other hand, I think there's a lot more going on than people give it credit for. And now you don't have to listen to that episode.
I'm looking forward to listening to it. I'm looking forward to seeing what you can teach me about Hell Money. So that'll be really, really good. Although it won't be me, it'll be Carl with you on that one. I'll be back very soon. You can find me at AJ Black Writer on Twitter if you want to look me up further, and all the details of where we are and what we're doing will be in the credits. But until next time, thank you so much for listening, guys, to the Pusher episode. I love Pusher. Can we just do this every week? Can we just do Pusher every week instead? Like let's just stop covering all the episodes. But again, thanks for listening, guys, and remember, until next time, cerulean blue is a gentle breeze. Cerulean blue. The Xcast, an X-Files podcast, is produced and presented by Tony Black, alongside a dedicated group of podcasters and X-Files fans. You can find us on Twitter at the Xcast, and on Facebook if you type in the Xcast, or at our group X-Files Basement, an Xcast podcast fan group, where you can continue the discussion about all things Mulder and Scully. If you want to support the Xcast further, you can now subscribe and become a patron of the show on Patreon. On Google, just type patreon.com/the Xcast. That's Patreon. You'll see all of our tiers, subscription options and perks, which include early access to episodes, bonus content such as commentaries on X-Files episodes, access to a patron chat zone, and even appearing on one of our patron roundtable discussions. We would appreciate any support you can give the show, so just go to patreon.com/thexcast to find out more. Our title music is provided courtesy of Will A, who you can find on Twitter at IamWillAYE.